We are here this morning with the very real nip of fall in the air. I questioned Siri when I arose about what the status of the outdoors was and was discouraged with her reply. I fear I may have to find long sleeve shirts before long. Yesterday's Pride event in Bloomsburg was nearly perfect. The sun was warm enough to be quite pleasant, but not too warm when it was out, and when the wind was still and not so cold that we were wishing for parkas and mittens when the clouds and breeze moved through the park where we were. Now, we naturally associate fall with the time of harvest, as it is the time when green growing plants put forth their fruits and seeds in an effort to propagate their species, and the time in which humans try to gather up all those fruits and seeds to better ensure the propagation of our species. And fall is also associated with the time of death and grief. In the weeks both before and after of the fall equinox, plants curtail their making of chlorophyll and allow their leaves to dry up and drop away, to decompose and become nutrients for next year's growth cycle. Chestnuts and walnuts fall to the ground and shed their thick outer husks to reveal the nuts within. Beans dry in their pods and wait for the harvester to scoop them and thresh them to be stored for winter. The green, bright yellow corn turns dry and turns that rustly pale brown, as it too awaits a machine that will turn it into feed for cattle and other meat animals. The magic of the season is that it is just that. It is a season. There are many weeks during which various crops mature and become ready for harvest, which is good because frankly, we would be unable to harvest them all if they all came ripe in, say, the second week of September. There would not be enough people, machines, space, or hours to harvest and process all that food. And whether it is nature that makes that so, or seed scientists who have selectively bred plants to stretch and adjust growing seasons, I do not care to know. I am fine believing that it is part of nature's wonderful order. Extended seasons of harvest have been the rule down through the ages. According to biblical scholars, harvest season in ancient Israel lasted for the better part of the year. Wheat and oats were harvested in May, barley in April, peas and lentils were both picked in late April and early May. Vetch was harvested in mid-April and again in mid-May. I learned that vetch is a fava bean. Chickpeas are brought in June with the first of the grape crops. July was a season for flax and for sesame, and the first part of the millet harvest, which stretched into early August. Lots of overlapping. Grapes, depending on the variety, were harvested in June, July, August, and September. Figs come ripe in August and September, as did pomegranates. Olives, again, depending on the varieties and topography, were harvested in September, October, and November. Keep in mind that all of this is adapted with the Julian calendar, superimposed over the calendar of the time. There were more months to harvest than there seemed to be for planting. But to be fair, grapes and figs and olives and pomegranates do not require planting each year. So that's something. But still, it's a very long season in which to harvest all the kinds of foodstuffs that the people needed to survive. But the harvest came in manageable stages so that nothing was wasted or lost. Grief is like that as well. All of the feelings of grief come to us in stages, not linear stages by any stretch, but stages to be sure. In pieces and parts, all of the parts of grief come to us. And frankly, if we had to manage them all at once, it would be like trying to harvest all of those crops during 1 week in September. We'd never be able to cope. Complex grief from traumas of a pandemic are not something we're going to get through in a couple of months and say, there, we're done, let's go forward. It's going to take time, and we're going to get sick of it, just so you know. Okay, we're going to get sick of it. We're going to say, oh, geez, why are we doing this again? Why does he keep talking about this? Because it affects how we relate to each other. I heard a wonderful piece on public radio this morning about kids who will be graduating from high school in 2023. Who've only ever sat in a classroom for maybe 6 months. Like a classroom not affected by COVID. You know, did the dances and the football games and all that stuff. And now they've had a year and a half, 2 years of online learning. And they're back in school, sort of. The ones who are healthy enough, who can take the risk. Everybody has to wear masks. Imagine high school with masks. And that's going to affect them for their lifetimes. They spoke about these young kids that they interviewed. They're not comfortable in big crowds. The idea of riding on a school bus absolutely horrifies them because they are so much more aware of germs than we ever were. I ever was. It's a lifetime that they're going to have to deal with this. And so it's going to take us more than a couple of months of, yay, we're done with COVID, to be through this. That grief will carry on. It will remain our companion. We will have to grieve not just the loss of those we have lost, which is real, but the loss of connection, the loss of touch. How many of us who live alone went without physical touch for almost a year? I remember the physical touch that I got was from my cats, my dog, and the person I touched most frequently was the cashier at the grocery store when she handed me my change. That was the extent of the physical touch I got in the first year. We are all going to have to grieve what we've lost, even if we can't always name it. So an interesting parallel to the grief and the harvest is that with the extended harvest season, I tell you what, the ancient Israelites knew how to grieve. The ancient Hebrews had actual people whose job it was to grieve. Like that was their job, was to show up at a funeral and be sad. Professional mourners, they showed up and were paid for wailing loudly to express the grief that perhaps the family just didn't have the capacity to express. You know, how rich a person was indicated by essentially how loud their funeral was. And it was a thing that was remarked in the story of Jesus and Lazarus, when Jesus arrives to find Lazarus dead in the grave for 3 days, and he weeps. And the people were surprised because that was usually the job of somebody who was paid to do that. And this guy wasn't being paid, but he was grieving. And so they remarked, look how he must have loved him. What a special thing that you cry without being paid. And in a time when healthcare largely relied upon the casting out of demons, death was pretty common, and so people were good at grieving. They had lots of tools and language and writings to help them express their grief. In the Hebrew scriptures, the prophets and the poets and the psalmists regularly cried out to the divine for relief from their grief, or revenge, or the death of the loved one. That's the other thing they did. But the Psalms were filled with the wailings of people beseeching their Lord for comfort in their grief. There are great swaths of text referred to as the laments. These folks knew how to grieve. They knew how to process that stuff. And like the harvest, they knew they were not going to get it all done at once. Grief and harvest are seasons, not events. And what we've been experiencing will take time, and it cannot be dismissed immediately in a nice, neat package. So I'm talking about this today to begin preparation for the time of the year that we celebrate around Halloween, All Saints' Day, when it is said that the veil between the realm of the living and the dead is as thin as it gets. Many traditions, that's when people will gather and say goodbye. After a year of grieving, they will bid their departed, their deceased loved one goodbye. We've hung out with you for a year, and now it's time for us to part. We're through this. That's a beautiful thing. Now, some traditions include an embodied afterlife, while others ritualize the letting go of the grief of those who remain living. So it is our grief that we let go, not necessarily the person who's gone, but it's when we allow ourselves to relax and allow our grief, we can let our grief go, which is a wonderful, because we can get good at grieving and then we can forget how to not grieve all the time, right? That's called depression. And it's good to ritualize the letting go of the grief. We can let go of our sorrow and our person that we've lost, but we can also let go of our grief and say, there, it's time. In a couple of weeks, we will have service on October 30th, in which we will explore some of the rituals people engage in around death and grief. And we will create an altar here where people can bring in pictures or images or treasured things that represent someone they've lost, and we can share them in this space. It's not going to be show and tell, because that just makes my teeth itch. But we will have our things here in a shared place, because that's something we haven't been able to do for 3 years, is share our grief in community. See, now I went and wandered off. Hopefully, the details are still really sketchy. Later that day, we'll have some sort of a ritual, some sort of a service of remembrance for those who we lost in the past year. How many folks here have lost someone dear to them in the course of this, just the time-wise of this pandemic? How many of you have been able to gather in community to mourn that loss with friends and family? 2 hands. It is important that we gather and acknowledge each other's sorrow, acknowledge each other's grief, acknowledge each other's feelings, because we've been disconnected for 3 years. deprived of touch, deprived of sitting next to each other. We're only now sort of inching the chairs closer together, right? And everybody's still a little squeamish about masks. We still have to do that. But it is important for us to share in community our feelings because we are social creatures. We are not little islands. We are creatures who live in community. From long before we came down from the trees, we lived in communities. I am aware of the grace that the universe has built into the processes of both grief and harvest. There's time built in. Doesn't all have to be done on Tuesday. The human psyche, the human spirit requires time to grieve and time and community to grieve. And frankly, the harvest requires time and community to happen. These are social connective activities, processes. Sometimes these things need to be addressed annually. In our family, for years and years and years, I don't know if my aunt still does it. There's an annual mass card that you have for somebody who has died. And I remember for a number of years after my grandmother's death, the flowers at church on a Sunday were put there in memory of my grandmother. It was a thing that we did at the end of September. She did at the end of September because I was broke. You know, and the flowers were there in memory of Dot Fortune. Healing, like justice, if it is delayed or deferred, is denied. We must experience the healing, and to get to the healing, as we used to say in my 12-step program, there ain't no other way through but through. You know, you can't go around, you can try going around, and good luck with that. But the way to healing is through the pain. It's through the pain. The way to rehabilitation is through the damn physical therapist, right? And if we avoid that work, if we avoid that ritual, if we avoid those feelings, then they will stunt our ability to live whole, spiritually rich, connected, loving lives. Together, we can feel our grief and our deep sorrow and leaning upon each other for support when we feel weak and without hope. I want you, as you are able, to look around, if you would. Can we get the Brady Bunch view here on the, well, you don't call it the Brady Bunch view? That is the Brady, right. Look at the faces you can see, the people around you, the folks online, the ones that some of you have not seen in person in years, but you see every week on the screen, right? This presence, feel the presence of the people. This congregation is like that ant colony. You know, the work you've done in 20 years has been what has sustained you through these times. And it is what will sustain us as we go forward. Hard times can be times of hunger or times of sadness or sickness or deep pain. We are in this together for the long haul. And we will be able to help each other feel our grief and let it go. I'm going to close this morning with one more poem from May Sarton. This is from her collection called Sonnets in Autumn. I confess I do not know the year of its published. This is May Sarton. If I can let you go as the trees let go their leaves, so casually one by one, If I can come to know what they do know, that fall is the release, the consummation, when fear of time and the uncertain fruit would not distemper the great lucid skies. This strangest autumn, mellow and acute, if I can take the dark with open eyes and call it seasonal, not harsh or strange, for love itself may need a time of sleep, and tree-like stand unmoved before the change. Lose what I lose to keep what I can keep. The strong roots still alive under the snow. Love will endure if I can let you go. Life and love is a never-ending process of gathering up and letting go. And by caring for each other, we make it all easier to bear.